Hi there. Welcome to today's lecture. Sorry it's getting up a little bit late. Several reasons why, all of which will be discussed on Wednesday. But for right now, let's get you through the content that should have been posted yesterday. A few housekeepings. One, A3 is due tomorrow, or pardon me, Wednesday at 11 a.m. We also have a quiz on Friday. It's active at 9 a.m. on Thursday. It'll be due by midnight on Friday. Since I'm getting this lecture a day late to you, I'm considering letting the quiz run also a day late and giving you guys Saturday to take it. That way, those of you who have a pretty consistent study regimen can make that. We'll also discuss that in class on Wednesday. Your midterm is next week. We do not have class at all next week. Remember that it's a cumulative over the course of the semester from Unit 1 through Unit 3. Okay? You also must have an appointment in order to take the assessment. If you do not have an appointment, then we got a problem. You need to check that out and make sure that you've got one today. That way you can take that assessment. We are going to do a review session in class on the 15th. Now, I'm not sure what kind of review sessions you're used to, but for purposes of this class, we are only going to answer the questions that you have. The TAs do not re-lecture. And will only last an hour. One of the things I want to make sure that you do is you don't just come with your unit reading checks or your unit quizzes and say, what's the answer to this? What's the answer to that? That is not a productive study session. You need to be sure to frame your questions in the form of questions that the TAs can actually answer. They don't know what all four options are, and if you haven't noticed yet, all four options actually change from between the assessments. So asking them a specific question to or a specific answer to a singular question is not going to be a successful review session. So make sure and come with questions. We're going to talk today about adolescence, and adolescence, of course, is someplace that you've all been, and actually, technically, some of you are still there. We give adolescents a hard time because it seems to be this period of independence building and personality building. You want to assert your own self. You want to make your own name in the world. You want to differentiate yourself from your parents, but without alienating other people as well. We try on a lot of hats during this time in our life. I sure think that this cartoon is pretty funny. In all actuality, the frontal lobe, which in this slide is labeled the birds and the bees lobe, obviously it refers to sex and burgeoning hormones and curiosities regarding intercourse and sexual relationships. But that frontal lobe, in all actuality, is the part of our brain that is the last to develop in adolescence, and that's the part of our brain that really focuses on reason, compare and contrast, making the best decisions possible. And it's kind of risky for us because since that's one of the last things to develop in adolescence, obviously adolescents are using other aspects of their brain for making their decisions. Anyway, check out the slide for a second. Which reminds me, at any point in time, you can stop and rewind this video similar to a YouTube post. All right, so let's talk about what makes somebody an adult. In our culture, we have turning 18, graduating from high school, full-time work, marriage, becoming a parent. Those three bullet points really signify some of our social hallmarks or milestones of when other people might look at us and say, wow, that person is an adult. They've graduated from high school, they're full-time employed, or they're married, they're parents, or that they're 18 years of age. Now, while these are sort of social constructs, we have some of these more internal constructs that are really what the research now refers to as being the hallmarks of being an adult, which are self-responsibility, independent decision-making, and financial independence. So if you were to ask yourself right now, if you were an adult, you'd have to be able to say, yes, that you have self-responsibility, which means that you pay all of your, you take care of all of your own decision making. You've chosen the major based upon your interests and not somebody else's. Independent decision making, meaning that the decision you make you can fully support, whether it be financially or socially or with any of those other resources that are important to a lot of the decisions we make. And then lastly, financial independence. Now, I totally get. I have a mortgage. I don't own my house outright, so technically I'm still financially dependent because I have a loan in order to support my house. So I'm not really financially independent from the bank. However, I am financially independent from my parents. And that is one of the hallmarks. And one of the things that we see now in our culture is that a lot of individuals are not financially independent from their parent until they're a lot older. When my father turned 18, he remembers the experience being basically he got a boot in his butt and got him out the door. And at 18 years of age, in our culture at that time, my father was expected to pay his own way, make his own way in the world. He received zero financial support from his parents. He actually played at Boise Junior College, which is now known as Boise State. He played football and used to flip burgers in the sub or the student union. So he had to make his own way and had to work for everything really when he turned 18, being sort of freed from his parents and identified as an adult, and legally at that time being responsible for his own behavior and his own outcomes. Today, financial independence is very, very different. We have what we call the boomerang generation now, which are adults by age returning to their family home. Oftentimes they're males rather than females, even into their 30s. And the reason being employment is difficult, especially right now in our national economic circumstance. But also men tend to hold seasonal work, construction, labor-based work that is really dependent upon the temporal environment, temperature, climate, all of the above, which would empower or enable them to work and maintain that. So financial independence is, I think, really hard won. And for those of you who are not financially independent, you will notice that some of the decisions that you make might actually get that financial support removed. And that's where we see the independent decision making and the self-responsibility, where you might lack the freedom to make choices based upon your dependence to your family. So in our culture, we don't really have too many rites of passage that signify that you're an adult. And we don't really have too many that signify that you're an adolescent. Different cultures identify adulthood and adolescence in different ways. And some of them you have to go out and be alone in the forest for a certain period of time and go on something like a vision quest. Or you might have to kill an animal, hunt a seal. They do that in the Inuit tribe. In other places, when girls become adolescents, they can have their clitoris removed. We in our culture find that to be barbaric and very difficult, but in that culture it is something that seems to be readily accepted. So we have different hallmarks in different ways to identify these. We're going to sort of segregate our conversation to, or limit our conversation to our culture and sort of how we look at this in the United States. It's unfortunate that this isn't a class-based level discussion, because I find that these conversations as far as rites of passage are really important. In our culture, we have some other, or we see other rites of passage in adolescence. Quinceañera is one rite of passage. Another rite of passage in, Jewish culture, and for the life of me I cannot remember off the top of my head what it is another sort of rite of passage into adolescence, where they read and they have a celebration. So we do see some examples within our sort of larger culture of these subcultures experiences of adolescence. In my family, there was very little recognition of adolescence. And then how do you mark that? In some cultures it's an age, but in some cultures it's when you actually experience one of the firsts, whether it's your first menstrual cycle or your first ejaculation. Those tend to be referred to as sort of the hallmark or iconic moments where we transition into adolescence, and then eventually through adolescence into adulthood. So let's talk about adolescence. We establish first what makes an adult, so we can understand what age range we're looking at, or what group we're looking at. Given these criteria, one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, are you an adult? Do you have self-responsibility? Do you have the opportunity for independent decision making? And are you financially independent? Those are three big criteria. And you, again, ask yourself, do you fit these? One of the things that we look at during this period, during this time period of transition from childhood through adolescence and into adulthood is how do you feel? And if you look at our little chart here, the age 12 to 17, a lot of them are kind of ambivalent. The majority of them are ambivalent about whether or not they feel that they have reached adulthood, even at 17 years of age. 18 to 25, we really see this shift. People are confident that they're adult, but we still have a percentage that say, no, they're not an adult. And we still have a significant percentage, or the majority, saying that they're kind of ambivalent. They're not sure if they're an adult or not. 26 to 35, you would think that these individuals would definitely identify themselves as an adult, but we still have a percentage identifying themselves as not being an adult. We have exponentially more people identifying themselves as an adult, saying, yes, I have reached adulthood, but we still have a pretty significant percentage of individuals saying that they're still ambivalent. By the age of 36, we're seeing less ambivalence. We're seeing fewer people saying no, that they're not quite yet an adult, and by far this is our strongest category of yes. If you look across those little columns and how they are rated, you see that there's this still in between like 18 and 26, or between 25 and 26, we really start to see this shift. One of the things that we see is we graduate from college. The age of marriage now has gotten quite a bit later. We're looking at the average age of marriage at around 26 years of age, and for a lot of people that is a hallmark or an identifying feature of adulthood. We have three time periods that we talk about in our research area. Developmental, early adolescence, 10 to 14. This begins with the onset of puberty. Now puberty will actually begins, the chemical part of puberty begins about 2 years before we start to see some of those external signs, changes in genitalia, the development of secondary sex characteristics, changes in voice, breast development, menstrual cycle, that's a primary sex characteristic. And then we have late adolescence, again up until that magical age of 18. And then we have this new category that we didn't really have until the 60s and 70s when we started to think about this transition, and it really became something that is consistent starting in about the 80s, that there's this range of 18 to 25 that we now call emerging adulthood. It just used to be early, middle, and late adolescence, and now we call it early, late, and emerging adulthood. In this time period of emerging adulthood, we experience additional identity exploration. There's still instability. There's still self-focus. Again, referring to the earlier slide with the columns, feelings of feeling in between. But then also there's this really wonderful sense of possibilities and acknowledging, what your future might be like. I know that a lot of you, while listening to this lecture, could even think about how many years you have left in college, and maybe some of you have yet to choose a major, and really wrapping your head around what that experience will be like for you. Eventually what you end up doing as far as a career, and then eventually as you develop your career, how do you advance in your career, how are you going to contribute to society? A lot of possibilities. Now I'm 38 years old. I'm out of that emerging adulthood, financially independent. I have self-responsibility, and I can also make decisions without anybody else's input, except for my husband, of course. But when I think about sort of where I am, I still see possibilities. I definitely still see possibilities. I still feel in between in some ways. As a parent, I've lost a lot of self-focused. One of the ways that we re-identify ourselves as individuals is when our children pass through critical developmental periods and start to become more independent, both physically and intellectually. You start to have more time to develop self-focus again. I do have quite a bit of stability, which I am eternally grateful for. Even in my employment, though, people can lose their job, and so especially given our economic climate, thinking about that instability is still there. And I am still exploring different identity aspects. Some things I'm pretty concrete in. But there are other ways and philosophies and personas that I'm still trying on. So while we talk about emerging adulthood, it's not as if these 5 bullet points become solidified. It's not as if you know that you're an adult when you've solidified all of these. These remain constants in your life. Developing, growing, expanding, all of those stay very consistent and become part of who you are as an adult. They are less intense and they're less volatile throughout. They're far more volatile in early adolescence, and they become less volatile as you become an adult and function throughout adulthood. Now, adolescence is described as the transition from childhood to adulthood. It's where we begin to prepare to take on adult roles and responsibilities in one's culture. Very important that we identify it as one's culture. We have different cultural individuals from different cultural backgrounds, even in our class. If this had been an in-class discussion, we would be able to talk a little bit more about how, what we do differently as an adult. Some kids start to get an allowance. Some kids get a cell phone. Some kids get chores. We see some of that sort of growing adult responsibility. How are you going to manage finances? How are you going to prioritize? Parenting literature suggests that it's at this time in your life where you really start to create an environment where your child can have input on the decisions that they make. That way, in that emerging adulthood, when they are making their own decisions, they've made them in the past, and so it's easier to make those decisions. Physical development, of course, we have primary and secondary sex characteristics. The primary sex characteristics are egg and sperm development. We've discussed previously that all women are born with all the eggs that they will have for their lifespan. Sperm regenerate every 72 hours. They start to produce. Now, many women do not start to actually release eggs in their menstrual cycle or throughout their ovulation cycle until about 2 years into their hormonal development. So we see that. Sperm development happens pretty quick. That's why when we hear stories of 12-year-olds getting women pregnant, it's completely feasible. And unfortunately, it's completely feasible that young girls can also get pregnant at that age. It's very individually dependent. Now, physical development, we have a time of first. I mentioned that we have our first menarche or menses. This is the first menstrual cycle for girls. As I mentioned earlier, its prelude is about 2 years long of hormonal changes. We get that idea through acne development. We start to see some maybe attitudinal changes, maybe different interests, maybe different emotional thresholds. But menarche is that first menstrual cycle. And some cultures, women, when they experience their first menstrual cycle, they're revered. They're referred to now as a maiden, and they have womanhood because now they can reproduce. Some women are shunned and they're sequestered and they're made sure to sort of stay away from any possible impregnation during that time or after that time, because that's the hallmark of being able to reproduce. Some women are sequestered during their bleeding period, during their menses or menstrual period, where they are sort of placed in a different environment because it's considered dirty or impure. Our culture, we have a different take on it. I've mentioned before that women have just as much control over anticipating their menstrual cycle as men do over controlling their erections, especially during this early time period. Their body is just very responsive and very reactive and has yet to do a lot with the thinking and the doing. And so there's a lot of vulnerability there. And for some women, there is some shame. Our culture still has a hard time wrapping our brain around how this is just a natural biological process and something that needs to happen in order for women to be able to reproduce. Spermarchy is the first male ejaculation. Oftentimes the first ejaculation is not manifested, which means that doesn't happen through masturbation. Frequently it happens through a nocturnal emission, or frequently referred to in our culture as a wet dream. This first is less monumental and less noticeable than the first menstrual cycle, at least for individuals throughout the family. It can actually go unnoticed depending upon the familial environment. Less recognized, but no less important. You know, the ability to ejaculate does mean and signify that this individual can now procreate. Now, interestingly, the male sort of hallmark of adolescent development is pleasurable. It is changes dopamine in the brain. It has all these wonderful, fantastical effects. Whereas for the female, the menstrual cycle oftentimes is accompanied by physical discomfort, emotional reactivity, sort of a management aspect. And so it's received as more of a burden and less of an opportunity. Whereas the spemarchy through ejaculation is sort of viewed as being differently. It's something that's considered very pleasurable. Myelin is the protein that we talked about in child development. I'd mentioned before that it peaks, myelination peaks during this period of development. We have the most proteins wrapping around our neurons that allow for speed of processing. It's also, unfortunately, we could basically categorize this as adolescents are being able to make bad decisions very quickly now because we are not using that frontal lobe yet. The majority of adolescent processing goes to the amygdala, which is our emotional reaction center, which means that we're going to fall on extremes. We're either going to be rageful or euphoric. And oftentimes that's why when we see adolescents, we think, wow, why are they just so polar? And it's because, you know, their brain and the way it processes has two sort of, it's either go or not go. And throughout adolescence, we start to use that frontal lobe. One of the ways that parents can encourage use of that frontal lobe is that when a child is being reactive or responsive, the parent can make it sort of a clinical exercise and say, list out a thing of pros and cons, or write down how you're feeling right now and tell me all about what you're thinking and how you're feeling and what you want and what you don't want. That way we can engage that frontal lobe and make the experience or the moment less emotional and more sort of cognitive or mental. Now, this order of pubertal events is kind of, it's rough, and this is how it's generally followed. This is not, you are not abnormal if you didn't follow this, but this is generally how they develop in sort of secondary sex characteristics and primary sex characteristics. Downy pubic hair shows up for females, testes for boys. Now, we don't have an age range on this because it varies by person and also by environment. One of the current theories is that women or young girls are starting their menstrual cycles earlier or initiating puberty earlier because of different environmental factors like processed foods, hormones in foods, hormones in our environment, hormones in the water, the amount of soy that we eat. Soy actually has a natural estrogen, which is great for women who are going through menopause, not so great for girls who are not yet developing, not yet at puberty. It sort of accelerates that process. The growth hormones and proteins like meat, milk, and cheese have also been sort of hypothesized to contribute to this earlier pubertal development. Appearance of breast buds for females follows the downy pubic hair, growth of testes, appearance of pubic hair for males. Girls go through the growth spurt earlier. That's why we see a lot of tall 6th grade and 7th grade girls. Boys end up catching up pretty soon thereafter. Growth of sexual and reproductive organs, we'd see menses by about this time. Increased growth in penis. Menarche, we see that happen after the growth spurt, after breast buds, and sort of as far as timing goes. Deepening of the boys for males. We start to have greater acne issues because we have more oil and more sweat. Secretion of increased skin oils and sweat for both males. That's when things start to get smelly. And the development of underarm hair and the development of facial hair. Now, oftentimes we're like, why do we have underarm hair? Why do we have facial hair? Why do we have pubic hair? Hair serves several purposes. One, it's really great at helping us heal from lacerations. The hair kind of binds with the different cells and blood and allows us to get a tighter sort of closure on a laceration if we have one. Hair also helps us to regulate temperature. One of the reasons why we have it around our genitalia is to sort of allow us to have different temperature changes. Underarm hair allows us to have different perspiration, provides more surface area for that. The hair actually helps to sort of hold some of that moisture back, and unfortunately it also holds the aroma as well. And so that's when we start to see the need for underarm deodorant or something to that effect. The psychological meanings of puberty, personal response related to information, cultural expectations. For some people, this is a really wonderful, fantastical time filled with respect and adoration. For others, this is considered a burden. A lot of it is culturally dictated. Timing of puberty is important. We see different advantages for boys versus girls. It is better for a female. It's better for a male to begin early. He's viewed as being stronger, more adept, more developed. If we take the evolutionary perspective, then this individual can provide resources at a younger age. For females, it's better to start late. It's more of a social burden to be the girl to have breasts before other girls. While the girls that develop later are like, oh, I really wish that, I had boobs or something along those lines. As much as they'd wish for it, the burden, the sort of sexual issues that come along with the perception of breasts on females is difficult, especially at an earlier age. And these are difficult not just because of social constraints, but also cognitive constraints. If you're developing your breasts later, you can wrap your brain around the responsibility, what they mean, what it means when boys think about them or touch them or snap a bra. There's a lot of cognitive things that are developing along with this. Over time, the lasting effects of early development on girls are far more extensive than the lasting effects on boys. Boys who develop late, not as socially of an issue as long as they reach the physical majority by the age of maturity. Girls tend to be scarred for life, for lack of a better term. Now, cognitive development, we're going to talk about Piaget again. During this stage of development, he started the theory or suggested that there was this period of formal operations. 11 to 15 years of age. We now know that by Piaget's definition, formal operations for some kids doesn't start until even after they are 18 years of age. Here are some of the hallmarks of formal operations. One being hypothetical or deductive reasoning. This is where you can do scientific thinking. This scientific thinking is where we really start to develop our ideas of logic, if-then statements, being able to develop hypotheses, develop ways to test those hypotheses. Ideally, a professor is going to be at the formal operations level of thinking because they've already gone through a rigorous program where they had to demonstrate their capacity for hypothetical and deductive reasoning. We can also talk about abstract thinking as opposed to that concrete thinking we were talking about where we have that ball of clay. The child can say that that's the exact same amount, and then if we take one ball and make little amounts, then the child who has yet to develop concrete understanding would say that there's more clay if there's more little balls of clay. Now, abstract thinking involves algebra, justice, and faith. These are things that are non-tangible. Algebra is difficult because you cannot weight out that. You can't make a pile of 4, make a pile of 5, and then put them together and add up what all those piles are. Algebra requires substitutions where you're substituting numbers for letters or concepts for numbers or concepts for letters. Justice, of course, Kohlberg's theory of moral development, the idea that somebody could do something wrong but still be right in doing that something wrong is very important at this age of development. And then faith. In some religions, we permit children to make a declaration of faith younger than this age of cognitive development. Some theorists would suggest that that might not be fair to the child and that it might behoove experts and families to allow that child to defer in making a declaration of faith before they can experience different kinds of faith and really be able to wrap their brain around what they believe and understand about a higher power or the universe and how it's organized or the expectations. And moral development along with faith, I mean, clearly they go hand in hand. We also have complex thinking that develops during formal operations, sarcasms and metaphors. A lot of kids don't really get sarcasm. Irony is also very difficult. That's one of the reasons why poetry is bigger poetry, like Dante's poetry, is harder to understand with younger children. Here are some of our isms that we use in America. A stitch in time saves nine. A chain is as strong as its weakest link. A living dog is better than a dead lion. I do not understand that one. I found that one online, and I'm like, and if anybody would like to explain that one to me, I welcome that dialogue. The early bird gets the worm. The grass is always greener on the other side. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Now, all of these are metaphors, and they sort of place a moral or a societal understanding into, different terminology. The last one I want to talk about as far as formal operations is what I think is the most important, and this is metacognition. This is the capacity to think about thinking, especially social perspectives, and being able to take somebody's perspective in debate, in philosophical discussions. Being able to take somebody else's perspective is fundamentally vital to your success in that relationship, and we see this in romantic relationships. If you lack the capacity to see somebody else's point of view, you are going to have a very difficult time interacting with and being successful in quite a few of those relationships. Metacognition, most importantly, I believe, is the key to change. An individual has to possess metacognition in order to be successful in fundamental therapy. And that's therapy where somebody is really going to change who they are as a person, whether they're dealing with addiction, whether they're trying to wrap their brain around abuse suffered as a child, whether they're trying to strengthen their marriage. Being able to think about thinking is understanding how you got to the behavior that you got to is fundamental to changing the behavior. So when we talked about behavior modification, and we said you've really got to figure out what the problem really is, and empowering yourself with that knowledge of what the problem really is the first great leap towards success in managing this. Now, social development. Erik Erikson's stage, identity versus identity confusion. This, of course, is when we're trying off different hats. We're trying to figure out who we are and what we believe in and what values we want to represent. I started off high school my sophomore year. I came to school the first day and I had penny loafers on and khaki pants and a polo shirt and pearls, and my hair was perfectly coiffed, and I had my contacts in, and that was my first day of high school. The last day of my senior year, I was wearing Birkenstocks, hadn't shaved my legs in quite a while, had my glasses on, and was wearing a tie-dye. I was a cliche at that point. Now, the pendulum has swung a little bit more. Now my stylistic choices represent different things. Oftentimes it's the idea that I want to be the professor and have a professional persona, and then sometimes I want to be a little funky and eclectic and have too many layers on. Sometimes I dress like Sporty Spice. One of the things that we run into, or one of the things we evolve into as an adult, is the capacity to be able to say, you know what, today this is how I feel, and I can represent that a little bit more. In adolescence, we are so struggling to sort of find our niche, that we find a sort of persona that we want to represent, whether it's somebody who is emo or goth or intellectual, and we want to represent that. Two of the fashion trends that I find really interesting right now is this geekish chic concept, where representing yourself as somebody who is intelligent and very deep thinking. The elbow patches on the sweater that we're starting to see, or the square-rimmed glasses without lenses in them that we're starting to see, or there was a Hello Kitty thing at the store the other day that was like geekish chic, and Hello Kitty had square glasses on and was like, what's your major? And I mean, so it's like we try on these different personas throughout adolescence. When we find one, we really try to commit, and we have very little sort of cognitive flexibility about what we're going to be in that moment. And so we really sort of try to commit to each one of those identities until we find one that fits. And then throughout adulthood, we sort of mix and match a little bit more, depending upon the needs of ourselves, the needs of our family, and the needs of our environment. James Marchia's 4 identity statuses. This is what I think is by far the most fascinating thing that we'll discuss in adolescence. He really believed that we could sort of break people down at any time in their life into 4 categories regarding different aspects of their identity. And in this example, I always choose a college major. Oftentimes when I'm giving this lecture, I'm giving it to freshmen who have yet to decide what they want to do. So we have 2 continuums. The first one is, has the person explored meaningful alternatives regarding some identity question? Now, that some identity question is, in our example, what's your major? The other continuum is, has the person made a commitment? And by commitment, I mean how much resources are you giving to that, what you've explored? So, for example, if somebody is given 0 commitment and they haven't explored at all, they're in the period of time what we call identity diffusion. And identity diffusion is where an individual isn't really looking and hasn't really started to give any time, money, effort, attention, or anything towards any one perspective. So if you're a general studies and you're just skating along and taking your classes and not really getting into any of them, but not really exploring anything else, and you have yet to declare a major, then you are probably in identity diffusion. We can use the same table when we talk about religion. We can use the same table when we talk about political ideology. We can talk about, different aspects of our identity throughout that. We also have identity foreclosure, where an individual is very committed, but they have not explored very much. Sticking with the example of the major, this is the student that I have that comes to school and says, I'm pre-med. And I say, oh, how did you come to that decision? They're like, because my parents told me to be pre-med. And I'm like, okay, all right, that's identity foreclosure. And one of the dangerous things about foreclosure is that people have yet to really come to that decision themselves. And any of you know that when somebody makes a decision for you, you feel less committed to that decision and less energetic about that decision. Now, if your parents, from your youth, you've said you wanted to be a doctor, that is something different, even, because you at some point in time explored, versus just choosing the degree or the major that their parents suggested. Identity moratorium, this is where we have no commitment, but we have lots of exploration. Very, very important. Very important. This is somebody who is taking, electives from different sides, really trying to figure out what they want to do. Definitely a space of great potential. And then lastly, we have identity achievement. Yes, this person has explored meaningful alternatives. Yes, they have made a commitment. And identifying identity achievement, they now have solidified their resources. They've started to spend time, money, effort, energy, any number of resources they've started to allocate towards that pursuit. Yeah. So, what I want to know is, what about you? I would like for you to go back to Jay Marchia's little table there and think about where you are at. Now, obviously, this is not going to be due on Tuesday. I will actually give you until Thursday to complete this participation. And I probably should have changed that slide before I started my little voiceover this time. But I'll give you guys until Thursday because we did get started a day late. Now, some of our historical perspectives of adolescence are funny. Given this first comic of the father talking to his son, he says, "You got suspended from school because you filled your teacher's desk drawers with horse manure and then nailed them shut. What were you thinking?" And the adolescent says, "I'm 15. I'm usually not thinking." And as you now know, that's kind of a mischaracterization of adolescents. They are thinking, they're just not using as much of their brain as we would like them to. And then the next one, the mother is talking to her son and she says, "I bet if I was an iPod, you would listen to me." And a little bit of that is about the identity differentiation and really establishing who you are as a person independent from your parent. And given this mother's stance, you might also assume that she might not have been the most reciprocating parent. When we talked about parenting in the childhood, infant and childhood discussion, and we talked about how those authoritative parents are the parents who have a high level of communication and also a high level of that warmth and support. but then also had boundaries. This parent might be referred to as one that, might have less give and take in the relationships. One of the things that we see in the parenting literature that I was talking about earlier is that it's really important at this time in development to create time and space for the adolescent to make some decisions of their own, but then also be held to those consequences as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed this voiceover of PowerPoint. I really hope that this one posts. This is the third time I've given the lecture in this way, sitting in my office feeling awkward. I missed you guys. This is really a fun discussion to have face-to-face. I might have to pick a different hybrid for the next semester. But I hope this was effective and efficient. Please remember to do the participation. I will give you until Thursday night at midnight, and then also I'm going to give you guys an extra day on the unit quiz just to ensure that you guys have the time to get the kind of studying in that you need.